All right. Yep, I'm here to talk about Three Forks of the Flathead. I wanted to start actually with a fundamentals overview. There's a lot of myths around wild and scenic rivers, so it's always helpful to make sure we're covering fundamentals before we get too far in the weeds. So you see on the map here, Three Forks of the Flathead. North Fork is that one that's at the top, has a pink highlight on it. Traveling from Canada down into the United States. That's a transboundary river. There's not many between Canada, well, in North America, there's not many, but there's a few. And then the Middle Fork, if you're following the clock rotation, that's the one that's sort of midway on the right-hand side there. It starts at green and turns to yellow. And then at the bottom of the map, you'll see the South Fork, which starts in green and moves to yellow. That's the Three Forks of the Flathead. From a wild and scenic river status in the United States, it's actually considered one river. It's one wild and scenic river, though it is three forks. So kind of depends on how you count things. Wild and scenic rivers are protected by federal law. It takes an act of Congress, the president signs it, and obviously there's advocates along the way advocating for that protected river system, or for that river to become protected. Fundamentals of a wild and scenic river have three elements that they, once designated, they are to remain free flowing. So no dams, no impoundments, things like that. It will keep that free flowing character in place. There also needs to be high water quality present. We do find that in the Three Forks of the Flathead. I'm going to share a little information about that in a minute. And then the third element is that there are outstandingly remarkable values. That is to say, there are things that either make the river unique or very rare in its character. I'm going to show you what the Three Forks outstandingly remarkable values are in a minute here. And then I want to help you understand what a wild river is, what a scenic river is, and also what a recreational river is. When they named that law, they did not do us managers any favors in how they used their words. There's actually three categories of rivers, even though you'd think by the title it's two. A wild river, that's a place where it's only accessible by trail. It's very primitive. There's almost no or none developments. And it's in places like designated wilderness areas or places that are just completely undeveloped and are primitive Americas, even in the language. You'll see that represented on this map in the green. The upper Middle Fork and the upper South Fork are wild rivers. They do occur mostly within the Great Bear and Bob Marshall Wilderness. There's actually a little stretch on the South Fork and an even smaller stretch on the Middle Fork outside of wilderness that's still wild because there's no roads, no development. And then let's go and look at that pink color, that being the upper North Fork. That's the scenic stretch. The definition for scenic is some limited development, and roads occasionally are present in the river corridor. Sort of think of it like a road crossing the river every now and then. And that is definitely the upper North Fork by definition. When I said scenic though, I never said in the definition anything about it needs to be beautiful. Certainly the upper North Fork is beautiful and very scenic, but it's actually about that development scale. It's sort of the middle ground of development, and that's what we see in the upper North Fork, what we call the upper North Fork here in the United States. And then you'll please look to that orangey yellow color. That's the recreational stretches, not named in the title of the law, but equally, and I'll argue even maybe the most important. The recreational definition is a section of river that has a lot of development and has roads very near it and continuously through it, as well as a railroad that can also happen. And that is definitely the case for the lower stretches of the North Fork, lower Middle Fork, and lower South Fork. There are roads, there's development, there's potential for more development, and there is a railroad bounding the lower Middle Fork too. So it meets that definition. When I gave that definition, nothing in there I said was about the great recreation potential. It's about that development scale. It's on the higher end of the development scale. Certainly there's great recreation qualities on these stretches of river, but it's actually about those classifications, wild, scenic, and recreational, or about the development scale, kind of spanning a spectrum there. I think just looking at the map here, anything I want to call out. You can see we have upper North Fork, lower North Fork, upper Middle Fork, lower Middle Fork, etc. As managers, we're compartmentalizing, if you will, and identifying that stretch, those particular stretches or reaches of river by their classification, and then that guides our interpretation for managing that section of river. And hopefully that anchors you a little into what the Three Forks actually looks like. This slide here shows some mileage, some numbers, facts, figures as well. So you see that we have wild miles, scenic miles, recreational miles, and also the miles by fork there. In total, we have 219 miles of designated wild and scenic river here in the Flathead National Forest. A wild and scenic river isn't just the river itself, it's a corridor, roughly a quarter mile on each side of a river. The federal land is to be a part of that corridor. So a quarter mile on both sides of the river of federal land. So that's Park Service land, National Forest land. If you add up that strip of quarter mile on both sides, it adds up to acreage, right? And in total for the National Forest, that's 35,000 acres. National Park, that is about a little less than 12,000 acres. Anyways, and that's our focus area. We prioritize managing for the wild and scenic river values at hand in that corridor on those acres. The lower box there, 54% of the total system is actually in wilderness. Much of our system is actually in wilderness. 85% of that corridor is also in federal ownership, the balance being private lands, state of Montana lands, et cetera. The boundary between the park and the forest, between Glacier National Park, Flathead National Forest, is the North Fork and Middle Fork. And it's different depending on the North Fork and the Middle Fork. For the North Fork, the boundary is the center of the deepest, most active channel. The Middle Fork is different. It's the high water mark on River Right. This causes some confusion for people and even some frustration. It is not because of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that this is the boundary. It's actually from the Organic Act that created Glacier National Park from the Forest Reserve back in 1910. In 1910, that's what they thought was a smart idea for making a boundary. It has nothing to do with the Wild and Scenic River status. So we've had that for, well, what? 110 years now, 111 years. Anyways, and that establishes some jurisdictional questions between the park and the forest on whose regulations apply where. Okay, I mentioned outstandingly remarkable values. Well, this graph shows you what we have assessed are present in the Three Forks of the Flathead. Further, as managers, it is our job to protect and enhance these outstandingly remarkable values. That's a phrase from the law. We are to protect and enhance these things when we make management decisions. You'll see that fisheries is an outstandingly remarkable value. Geologic, those beautiful colored stones that we see in the river that are system-wide. Special geology and opportunity to observe geology. You'll see that we have very high water quality here. Wildlife, no one, I don't suppose, who knows the crown of the continent is surprised to see these things. We have some botanic resources that are special here, but not in all stretches. It sort of depends on the location that we're talking about, et cetera. I'm not going to call them all out here, but we do have a resource assessment document that I can share later on. And again, our mandate is when we take management actions, whether the park or the forest, is we're to ensure that we protect and enhance, and if we can, enhance these ORVs as we take management actions. We keep those things that made this river special and we're designating, we keep those intact, and we even maybe try to make them better. Who are the river managers? It's primarily a Glacier National Park, Flathead National Forest. Flathead National Forest is the lead. We do hold the preponderance of the mileage, including all of the South Fork and all of the upper Middle Fork and very lower Middle Fork. But we cooperate closely with Glacier National Park. I've considered some of the National Park employees to be some of my closest coworkers. You'll see in the upper right corner there, that was a management float trip that we did together with this park superintendent and the Forest Service line officer as well. You see a few pictures here of river rangers, et cetera. We also work with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and we have a new partner, Flathead Rivers Alliance, showing up as nonprofit river stewards. And we have a number of projects in development with them. I'm looking forward to adding a picture of FRA in this slide here. I mentioned water quality. We're doing, in addition to sort of regular broad scale water quality monitoring, we're starting to do more with water quality monitoring ourselves with our staff and the river rangers. One of the things we're doing is monitoring for E. coli presence in the water system. Reminder, E. coli can come from any mammal, not just humans. But nonetheless, monitoring for it is a prudent thing to do. You can see the recent monitoring, we're coming in extremely low. 32 is considered the standard for Clean Water Act, for drinking water, et cetera. We're also working on a citizen science project with adventure scientists where citizens can register, receive water quality testing kits, and gather water quality information and submit that. If you want to look at that, look at doing that yourself, go Google adventure scientists and look into their Wild and Scenic River water quality monitoring program. Okay, I want to make, this is a common misunderstanding in wild and scenic rivers. Vegetation management. A lot of people perceive that once the river is designated, there can be no vegetation management. That is not the case. In a wild section of river, that would probably be very difficult. Reminder, the definition of wild is where there are no roads and it's only trails. We're probably going to have a hard time doing vegetation management if there's no roads. Doesn't mean it's not possible. I'm just saying that's very difficult and there's no development. Increasingly we're focusing our work around developed areas for fuels reduction purposes. If there's no development, why would we be doing that work there? But scenic stretches and recreational stretches, that makes a lot more sense. There are road systems there, there's the access to the resource, and there's development. So we can do vegetation management in the Wild and Scenic River corridor. We have to ensure when we propose to do that, that we've built into the guidelines and into the plans, best management practices to protect water quality, to protect the outstandingly remarkable values, et cetera. And that's standard practice. Here are 3 recent examples. For the North Fork, around Big Creek Campground and the Glacier Institute campus, we've done hazardous fuel reduction there, so as to protect those facilities from a wildfire. And if you've driven that, you should see some what looks like a managed forest there. On the Middle Fork, around plus or minus Essex and Pinnacle, those communities, we have an ongoing implementation of a number of commercial sales and fuels reduction projects for the purpose of reducing the risk of fire around those communities. And then the last one I want to share here is on the South Fork, around the Spotted Bear campground area. We've done prescribed fire a number of times in the last number of years as a way of trying to return the forest in that area to its proper fire cycle interview and have a healthy forest there. So those are some examples of vegetation management in a wild and scenic river corridor. We do also acquire conservation easements and just outright acquisitions of land. It's not very common, but it does occur. And you'll see on this slide here, we've acquired around 5,200 acres from designation in 1976. So we've not acquired a lot of land, but we have acquired some very important parcels. The West Glacier River access site, that was acquired by the National Forest from a private landowner who sold to the National Forest. That was their choice, they sold. Can you imagine the Lower Middle Fork without any access at West Glacier? There was no other access. That was an important parcel. We've also acquired a big tract with the Rocky Bar O Ranch, Kintla Ranch, Nyack Flats as well. Recently, last year, we acquired a small parcel near the Pole Bridge and Ben Rover Cabin. The acquisitions, whether it's conservation easements or just outright acquisitions, they're always, there's no condemnation. In fact, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act kind of precludes by structure condemnation. So when we acquire parcels, it is always from a willing seller. Recreation management, which I think is what we're here to focus on a little more. Some of the things that we do in that realm is maintaining river access sites. It's a constant thing to maintain outhouses, keep the bulletin boards intact, do a little landscaping, try to keep things safe. With the maintenance part there, I want to share Great America Outdoors Act in the United States is putting additional funding to us taking care of deferred maintenance, taking care of the things that were starting to get shabby and worn out, trying to get those things upgraded. So we actually have some things in works here to make things look a little nicer. It'll take a little bit here, but we've got some money coming to do that work. We monitor use levels and trends. Every time we patrol, river rangers, we're keeping detailed notes on the numbers of people encountered, what type of group were they an angler, were they a float party, were they camping on shore, detailed notes along those lines so that we can look at long-term trends and manage according to our plan, which I'll try to show you here in a minute. We issue outfitter and guide permits. We have a very regulated system for that. There are 4 main outfitters in our area, and we're not in a position to be offering more permits. We are maintaining what we have. Those outfitter and guide fees that they pay are all returned to the National Forest, 95%, not 100%, 95% are returned to the National Forest and are what we use to sustain our program, pay for the river rangers, et cetera. We have various rules and regulations here, food storage for grizzly bear purposes, fishing regulations, camping regulations. Depends on where you are, what's in effect, but there's a whole program to have those regulations to try to help manage use. We issue river patrol reports. Each time the river rangers go out to patrol, we have a follow-up report so that people want to plan their own trip. They can see what it took us, the time it took for us, and any heads up we wanted to give people. Last one here is we sell a 3 Forks of the Flathead float guide. I've got my copy right here. I think it's $14. And when anyone calls me and wants to start planning a trip on the 3 Forks, the first question I say to them is, do you already have your 3 Forks float guide? I can't help you plan a trip if you don't have a map that gives you all the information. We've worked hard on that float guide and want to make sure everybody has it in their hands. Some of our partners, I think I mentioned this earlier, Glacier National Park. In fact, I'm just gonna move on from that slide. Challenges, opportunities. We are receiving generally fewer funds from congressional sources for our river system outside of the Great America Outdoors Act. Separate from that, we're receiving less allocation from Congress for the river system. But we are increasingly relying on the outfitter and guide funds to help us keep going forward with the work we want to do in the river system. So the outfitters, their business helps benefit everybody is part of the point I'm trying to make here. There are lots of concerns about increasing use and even changing use patterns in the river corridor. We have what's considered an old river management plan. Our river management plan was drafted between 1980 and 1986. We are in the process with Glacier National Park, the forest and the park are working to update our river management plan and make it into a comprehensive river management plan, modernize it and have it meet current statutory requirements and address the challenges that we have today in the river system. We're always trying to increase our partnership with Glacier National Park. That's constant work for us. I mentioned Great America Outdoors Act helping us with deferred maintenance, Flathead Rivers Alliance, and I ask you, what do you perceive are the challenges and opportunities in the 3 Forks of the Flathead? Go ahead and nominate what you think is a challenge and opportunity in the chat box. So I think I don't have a lot of time here left. I just want to show you a quick glimpse at something here. I mentioned that we do detailed note-taking essentially of when we're patrolling the rivers to try to document the amount of use that we're seeing. You see, this is the form in front of you here. It's a hard copy form. We're actually in the process of converting it into a Survey 123 electronic format. That being said, I'm not sure how much I want to use my phone to enter data while I'm on the river. We might still be using that paper copy, I think. This is kind of an experiment. But you see on here, we track all of the encounters we have on the river and we track all of the encounters we have on the shore. The word encounter is kind of confrontational. Maybe that's not the best word, but the number of times we see other people and we're tracking their craft type, how many are in their group, etc. From that data that we collect, we can share this kind of information. For the lower Middle Fork, as an example, our management plan says that, actually I want to go forward one slide. This is for the lower Middle Fork. This is the average number of encounters with other parties, not people, parties, that we ourselves had when we were out floating on the lower Middle Fork last year. So over the last 10 years actually. So 2021, we patrolled the lower Middle Fork a number of times and we kept track of exactly what we saw. And we saw an average over the season, 3 other parties per day. You can see that's varied over time, but it's actually pretty tight there. The orange line at the top, what I want to show you is our management plan says, our current management plan says we don't want to see more than 10 parties per day on average. So we are meeting that standard here. I'm going to try to show you the same thing for the Upper North Fork. This shows the average number of encounters over the season that we had, which is a proxy for what the public has, their experience. This is the average number of encounters with other parties per day. The orange line shows the management standard we have. That the management standard for the Upper North Fork is 3 parties per day. So that's very different than the Lower Middle Fork, where we expect to see a lot of people, where it was 10 parties per day. The Upper North Fork, our plan currently says no more than 3 parties per day. We have a tighter standard there. And you can see we've exceeded it, but then we're back in, and then we're kind of like playing around with it. It's a little kind of all over the place. And that's why one of the reasons why we're working on our management plan. Is this the right number to be managing for? Can we do a better job of gathering data to be more accurate, et cetera? I think with that, I want to pause. I can show you more data, but I think it's best for me to pause here and try to check in on questions, et cetera.
Thank you, Colter. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask directly? And can also encourage them. We're running a bit tight on time, but if there's questions, I don't see any directly in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, and if anyone has a hand up, maybe someone let me know, because I can't see everyone's. You should rise to the top for me, but oh, Mike.
Hello there, Colter.
Hi, Mike.
Hey, so do you anticipate any need in the future on any of the forks for a permit system?
Oh, thanks, Mike. The current river management plan we have authorizes us to implement a permit system once we are consistently meeting those standards. So I showed you that there's a 10 party per day standard for the Lower Middle Fork, 3 parties for the Upper North Fork, for example. Our current river management plan says that we are authorized to implement a permit system once we start consistently reaching those thresholds. That is part of the point of taking a fresh look in our river planning, is to validate, are these the right numbers? Are they not? Because we're in some cases close to being on the cusp of being able to implement a permit system. The new plan will also have that option. It will say, once you meet these triggers, these thresholds, Flathead National Forest, Glacier National Park, you can implement a permit system. So people worry greatly, oh, there might be a river, or there might be a permit system going forward. I'm going to remind everybody, it's already on the books. It can already happen.